So welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about CFOs and their opinions on some strategic issues with COVID-19. And joining me is a familiar face on the show. Please welcome Paul DeNicola, who's a principal with PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, TK. How are you doing today?
Good. You look very studious there with all those books behind you. And we know that CFOs, if you think that a CEO is the heart of an organization, I would say that the CFO and the general counsel are the lifeblood. Okay, so PwC takes a look at the CFO's opinion, and it seems like the CFO, it's a good one to survey because they seem to touch everything in the organization. At some point in time, they or their team seem to touch everything. So first of all, it might be a good idea. You do this pulse of CFOs. So can you just explain to our audience actually what the survey is?
Sure. So PwC has conducted a survey of U.S. finance leaders, including CFOs, every 2 weeks for the last several months. And what we've tried to do is track how views have evolved throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The most recent survey captures the views of about 300 individuals during the week of May 4th. So maybe it's beneficial just to think about some context around that. The April economic numbers became available, and we saw during that week the unemployment rate rise to 14.7%, and we've seen it increase even more since then. And we also saw, at the time we did this survey, some states beginning to ease restrictions in the hope of restarting their economies. I think overall, the theme of the survey, at least for this piece of time, is that companies seem to be adopting or adapting, I should say, to the evolving environment. And there's a little bit more positivity than we've seen in prior incarnations of the survey.
So one of the important issues that was asked in the survey was about both customer and employee safety. And CFOs seem to generally be getting more confident in the ability to make conditions safe for both customers and employees. Employees sort of had a little, an additional layer of concerns. Talk a little bit about the issue of safety for both customers and employees.
So I'd say that overall, leaders are more optimistic than employees are. Leaders are more optimistic about their ability to provide a safe workplace and working environment in thinking about returning to work. But employees do express some concerns. So maybe talk about the leaders first. If you think about the actions that companies are planning to implement, what are they going to do in this transition back to work? Almost all CFOs and finance leaders said that they're going to change their workplace safety measures or requirements in some way, right? 3/4 are going to reconfigure the actual physical work site to be able to promote physical distancing. You're going to see shifts. Almost 60% say they're going to shift, change shifts to reduce exposure. And in my mind, maybe the most systemic change will be that in terms of 43% say that they're thinking of making remote work a permanent option for roles that allow for it. And I think this will have a significant impact on both commercial real estate and also on the overall trend toward urbanization, right? Having offices located in highly dense urban areas. So I think that there's a high degree of confidence among finance leaders that they'll be able to adapt to the return from work. But employees are more concerned. Half of them say that they fear getting sick at work, and that would impact their decision around whether or not they would return to the workplace if their employer requested it tomorrow. More than half want their employer to provide PPE, personal protective equipment. And at the same time, they're wary of being monitored upon the return to work, right? So concerns about employers tracking their location and proximity, right, to those who have been infected. Worrying about cameras in the workplace, worrying about mandatory testing on the part of employers for COVID-19. So there's certainly that monitoring aspect that employees express concern about. So different perspectives between executives and employees on this matter.
Yeah, well, we know that it's not going to be business as usual trying to get people back to work. And so it'll be interesting to see how all that evolves. And certainly we're going to stay close to it as it does. So another area that seems very logical for CFO is cost containment. And it's interesting as I watch the different sets of 2 weeks sort of go, the dire predictions of both layoffs and of delaying investment in certain projects seem to get brighter, as time goes on here. So, to talk a little bit about the sort of change in attitude from this group, at least on what you've seen in survey results.
Yeah, no, cost containment obviously remains a huge area of focus. It's one of the key areas that businesses can control. There's a lot that's outside of the control of business, but they can control cost to some extent. I think that the data is pretty consistent from a couple of weeks ago, with the exception that in a few cases, companies are slightly, and I say slightly, easing up in their views on future containment plans. So 8 out of 10 companies say they're still considering additional cost containment measures going forward. That's down from 86% the prior 2 weeks, but still 8 out of 10. On the issue of layoffs and furloughs, about a third still expect layoffs within the next month, and a little bit more than a third anticipate furloughs over the next month. Now, those numbers are both down a couple percentage points from a few weeks ago, but still pretty dire, as you stated. And in terms of overall investment, 6 and 10 say they're considering additional delays or outright cuts to planned investment going forward. So I think that the big picture is still grim, but slightly improved from 2 weeks ago. Sort of like how this entire epidemic is developing right now.
So we have about a couple of minutes left, but I certainly didn't want to end this until we had a chance to talk about what I think is one of the biggest lessons that companies have learned, and that's supply chain risk. So many companies were affected as foreign countries shut down, or they had those reliable, what they thought were reliable flows, and all of a sudden that wasn't the case, and they had supply chain. They didn't have options. They didn't have enough supply chain options. So this certainly is going to cause change for the future. But talk a little bit about what the survey said about supply chain.
With regard to supply chain, I think this is another one of those areas for systemic change. When you're looking at both the overall trend toward globalization that we've seen over decades, and whether, how virtuous those decisions were, and also around razor-thin supply chains. So I think that there'll be significant developments here. I mean, when we look at the survey, leaders are continuing to develop their understanding of supplier health and trying to take action there. So about half are trying to work through the financial and operational health of their suppliers. And that's pretty much been in line with the results of the last few surveys. But about half are looking at alternative sourcing options. which is a significant number. And those who aren't are looking at, particularly at the terms of their contracts, to be able to provide them the ability to better manage risk going forward, and to have more consistency across suppliers. So again, this is systemic change might be coming in this area.
So the survey covers other areas. We only hit on three obviously critical areas, but there's other information in the survey. So where can people who are curious see a copy and a copy of the results?
Sure. So it's right on the PwC homepage, pwc.com. You can get to the COVID-19 CFO Pulse and find all the data right there.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for joining us and wherever you're sequestered. But this is great information. Again, I'll watch to see if attitudes change. I'm particularly interested in the employee customer return issue. It's a huge issue that everybody's dealing with, and it's a challenge for boards on when and what to do relative to that. So thank you for taking the time, and we appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.